The wind came down off the Laramie Range like something alive and starving, and Noah Keller rode straight into the teeth of it because a woman he had never met was waiting somewhere in that white nothing, and he had given his word he would bring her through. It was the 9th of January, 1887, the worst winter the Wyoming Territory had seen in memory, the kind of winter old-timers would speak of for the rest of their lives as the year the cattle froze standing up and the rivers turned to iron. Noah had been 3 days on the trail already, 3 days of drifts higher than a man's saddle horn, of ice that cracked like rifle fire beneath his horse's hooves, of a cold so deep it worked past wool and hide and into the marrow of his bones. His face was raw beneath his scarf, his eyelashes crusted white, and somewhere behind him, wrapped in every blanket he owned, sat a woman named Beatrice Underwood, who had crossed half a continent to marry a man she had never laid eyes on, and who did not yet know that the life waiting for her at the end of this ride had already slipped away like water through cupped hands. He did not know it yet either. He only knew the wind and the cold and the small, shivering weight of the woman behind him on the wagon seat and the promise he intended to keep no matter what it cost him. 2 weeks earlier, none of this had seemed possible. Elias Grant was a rancher of 41 years, a widower with a good spread of land along Sweetwater Creek and no wife to warm his house through the long winters. He was not a cruel man, nor an unkind one, but he was practical in the way that men who worked the land had to be, and after 3 years of grieving his first wife, he had decided that a ranch needed a woman in it the same way it needed cattle and water and a roof that did not leak. So he had written to a matrimonial agency in Missouri, the kind that placed advertisements in newspapers for lonesome men and hopeful women, and after an exchange of letters that spanned the better part of a year, he had settled on a young seamstress from St. Louis named Beatrice Underwood. Elias had broken his leg falling from a hay loft 2 weeks before her arrival, and could not make the 2-day ride to Rock Springs to fetch her from the train himself. So he had done what any sensible rancher in the territory would do. He had sent word to Noah Keller. Noah kept a small horse ranch 4 miles east of Sweetwater Bend, a town that amounted to a mercantile, a church, a saloon, and perhaps 40 souls who called it home. He was 29 years old, broad through the shoulders from years of ranch work, with dark hair that he kept cut close and eyes the color of creek water in autumn. He had lost his own parents in the blizzard of 1871, when he was a boy of 13, and the memory of that cold had never fully left him. He was known throughout the territory as a man who could read weather like scripture, and find his way through country that would swallow other men whole. It was for this reason, and no other, that Elias Grant had sent a boy on horseback to Noah's ranch with a hastily scrawled note. "Noah, I am laid up with a broken leg and cannot ride. My intended bride arrives at Rock Springs Depot on the 11th. I would consider it the greatest favor a neighbor ever did me if you would fetch her safe to Sweetwater Bend. There is money enclosed for your trouble. Elias." Noah had read the note twice by lamplight, turning the folded bills over in his hand, and had felt something he could not name, a kind of restlessness, though he told himself it was only the thought of 2 days' hard riding in weather that already smelled of snow. He had agreed, because that was the way of things in a country where neighbors depended on each other to survive, and because he had nothing keeping him at home but a barn full of horses and a house too quiet for a man his age. He had no way of knowing, as he saddled his horse the next morning and set out for Rock Springs, that the woman he was riding to collect would change the whole shape of his life. Beatrice Underwood had grown up in a narrow brick house on the edge of St. Louis, the eldest of 3 children, until a fever took her mother and youngest brother within a week of each other, when Beatrice was 16. Her father, broken by grief, had taken to drink, and by the time Beatrice was 20, she was the one holding the household together, taking in sewing work to keep her remaining brother fed and clothed. It was hard, unglamorous work, the kind that injustice always seemed to hand to women who had done nothing to deserve it. And Beatrice had grown up fast and grown up tired, though she had never once let bitterness harden her heart. She was 23 years old when she saw the advertisement in the newspaper, tucked between notices for patent medicine and land sales in the Western Territories. Rancher widower, 41 years, seeks wife of good character for companionship and household duties. Must be willing to relocate to Wyoming Territory. Correspondence encouraged. She had written back on impulse, more out of a desperate hope for something different than any real romantic notion, and Elias Grant's replies had been kind, if plain, full of descriptions of his land and his cattle and his hope for a quiet, steady life with a good woman beside him. There was no poetry in his letters, but there was honesty, and after so many years of hardship, Beatrice found herself drawn to the plainness of it, the promise of stability, of a home that was hers, of open sky instead of narrow brick streets. She had said her goodbyes to her brother, now old enough to manage on his own with a job at the rail yard, and had boarded a train west with a single trunk containing everything she owned in the world, including her mother's wedding ring, which she wore on a chain around her neck because it did not fit her finger, and a Bible with her family's names written in the front in her mother's careful hand. The train had been delayed twice by weather before it ever reached Rock Springs, and by the time Beatrice stepped down onto the platform on the 11th of January, her feet numb in her thin boots and her breath clouding in air so cold it hurt to draw it into her lungs, the sky above the Wyoming Territory had already turned the color of a bruise, heavy and low and waiting. She had expected Elias Grant to be there to meet her. Instead, she found a stranger. He was tall and broad, and wrapped in a heavy coat and a wool scarf that left only his eyes visible, eyes that studied her with a kind of careful assessment that made her stand a little straighter despite her exhaustion. "Miss Underwood?" he asked, his voice rough from the cold. "Yes," she said. "And you are?" "Noah Keller. Elias Grant broke his leg 2 weeks back, asked me to fetch you to Sweetwater Bend in his stead." He nodded toward a wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses, the bed loaded with blankets and supplies. "I know it isn't the welcome you were expecting." Beatrice felt a flicker of disappointment, quickly suppressed. She had crossed a continent to marry a man, and instead she was being handed off to a stranger like a piece of freight. But she was not a woman given to complaint, not after the life she had lived, and so she only nodded and allowed Noah to help her up into the wagon. "How far is it to Sweetwater Bend?" she asked as he climbed up beside her and took the reins. "Ordinarily, a day and a half," he said, glancing up at the sky with an expression Beatrice could not quite read. "But there is weather coming, Miss Underwood. I would not be surprised if it takes us longer." She did not know then how much longer, nor how much that delay would come to mean for both of them. They set out from Rock Springs in the gray hour before noon, the wind already picking up, carrying with it the first thin flakes of snow that stung Beatrice's cheeks like needles. Noah had wrapped her in a heavy buffalo robe from beneath the wagon seat, insisting over her protests that she would need it before the day was through, and she had been grateful for it within the hour, as the snow thickened and the wind grew teeth. They spoke little at first. Beatrice was not accustomed to the silence of the open country, so different from the constant noise of the city she had left behind, and she found herself studying the landscape with a kind of wary wonder, the rolling white hills, the dark smudges of distant hills, the enormous gray sky that seemed to press down on everything beneath it. "You are not what I expected," she said finally, when the silence had stretched long enough to feel uncomfortable. Noah glanced at her sideways. "How do you mean?" "I expected Mr. Grant. I did not expect to be escorted by a man I have never heard of, through country I have never seen, into weather that looks like it means to bury us both." There was no accusation in her voice, only a kind of tired honesty that made Noah's mouth twitch into something almost like a smile. "Elias is a good man. He would have come himself if his leg allowed it. He thought a great deal of your comfort, sending someone he trusted rather than risking the journey with a hired stranger. "And are you to be trusted, Mr. Keller?" "I would like to think so, Miss Underwood." He looked ahead at the road, or what passed for a road beneath the gathering snow. "I have lived in this country my whole life. I know its moods better than most men know their own kin. If anyone can get you to Sweetwater Bend safely, it is me. That much I can promise you." Beatrice pulled the buffalo robe tighter around her shoulders and said nothing more for a long while, but something in the steadiness of his voice had eased the knot of anxiety in her chest, if only a little. By the time the light began to fail, the storm had become something Noah did not like the look of at all. The wind had shifted to come screaming out of the north, and the snow no longer fell so much as it flew sideways, stinging and blinding, erasing the horizon until Beatrice could not tell where the earth ended and the sky began. Noah had slowed the horses to a walk, watching the terrain with the careful attention of a man who had seen what happened to travelers who misjudged a Wyoming blizzard. "We cannot go on much further," he said, raising his voice to be heard over the wind. "There is a line shack a mile or so ahead, used by cowhands in the summer months. We will shelter there until this passes." "And if it does not pass?" Beatrice asked, her voice tight with the first real fear she had allowed herself to feel. "It will pass," Noah said, though privately he was not so certain, and he did not like the way the temperature seemed to be dropping with each passing minute, nor the way Beatrice had begun to shiver despite the buffalo robe. "Storms always pass, Miss Underwood. The question is only how many days it takes them to do it." They found the line shack by a stroke of luck as much as skill, a low sod roof structure barely visible through the whiteout, and Noah half lifted Beatrice down from the wagon and half carried her the last few steps to the door, which had frozen shut and required him to put his shoulder against it twice before it gave way. Inside, the shack was small and bare, containing only a rusted stove, a stack of firewood left by some thoughtful cowhand the previous summer, and two narrow cots against opposite walls. But it was shelter, and after the fury of the storm outside, it felt to Beatrice like the finest house she had ever entered. Noah worked quickly, unhitching the horses and leading them into a lean-to attached to the shack's east side, then building a fire in the little stove with hands that shook slightly from the cold. Beatrice sat on one of the cots, still wrapped in the buffalo robe, watching him work, and found herself struck by the competence of his movements, the way he seemed to know exactly what needed doing and did it without hesitation or complaint. "You have done this before," she said, when the fire had finally caught and begun to throw a thin, welcome warmth into the small room. "More times than I would like," Noah admitted, settling back on his heels before the stove. "This country does not forgive foolishness, Miss Underwood. A man learns quick or he does not live long enough to learn slow." "Please," Beatrice said, "call me Beatrice. It seems foolish to stand on formality when we may be trapped in a line shack together for who knows how long." Something in Noah's chest loosened at that, though he could not have said why. "Beatrice, then, and you may call me Noah if it suits you." "It suits me," she said, and for the first time since stepping off the train at Rock Springs, she felt something like a smile tug at her own mouth. They ate a simple supper of hardtack and dried beef that Noah had packed for the journey, sharing it in a companionable silence broken only by the howl of the wind outside and the occasional pop and crackle of the fire. As the evening wore on and the cold outside deepened into something murderous, Beatrice found herself, almost without meaning to, telling Noah about her life in St. Louis, about her mother's death and her father's decline, about the long years of sewing by lamplight to keep her brother fed. She had not spoken of these things to anyone in years, had learned to hold her grief close in private, but there was something about the small, fire-lit room and the man who listened without judgment or pity that loosened her tongue. "It sounds a hard life," Noah said quietly when she had finished. "It was the life I had," Beatrice said, with a small shrug that did not quite hide the old ache beneath it. "I do not say it for sympathy, Noah. Only so you understand why I answered Mr. Grant's advertisement. I was not seeking romance. I was seeking a chance at something steadier than what I had. There is no shame in that, Noah said. This is hard country, Beatrice. Most folks who come here are running from something or reaching for something they could not find elsewhere. I do not think less of you for wanting steadiness. And you, she asked, what are you running from or reaching for? Noah was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. My parents died in a blizzard much like this one when I was 13 years old. They went out to check on the cattle during a storm and never came back. I have spent every winter since half expecting the same to happen to me. I suppose I have spent my whole life reaching for some kind of certainty that this country does not much care to offer. Beatrice felt her heart ache for the boy he must have been, alone and frightened in a world that had taken so much from him so young. I am sorry, Noah. That is a terrible thing for a child to carry. It was a long time ago, he said, though the tightness in his voice suggested the wound had never fully healed. I do not tell you for pity, only so you understand why I do what I do, why I could not have let you make this journey with any less care than I have given it. The wind howled outside, rattling the shack's small window, and for a moment neither of them spoke, content to sit in the shared warmth of the fire and the strange, sudden intimacy of two strangers who had, in the span of a single day, begun to trust each other with the weight of their pasts. The storm raged through the night and into the following day, trapping them in the little shack as drifts piled higher against its walls. Noah kept the fire burning steadily, venturing out only to check on the horses and to shovel a path to the lean-to, returning each time with his beard crusted in ice and his cheeks raw from the wind. Beatrice, for her part, found small ways to be useful, mending a tear in Noah's coat with a needle and thread she had packed in her trunk, an act that seemed to please him more than she expected. "You have a fine hand for stitching," he said, examining the mended seam with something like admiration. "It is the one skill my hardship taught me well," Beatrice said. "I have made and mended enough clothing in my life to outfit a small army." "Elias will be glad of that skill," Noah said, and something in his voice, some small note of reluctance, made Beatrice look up at him curiously. "You do not sound certain of that." "I only mean," Noah said, choosing his words with care, "that Elias is a practical man. He will value what you bring to his household. I only hope he values you as well, Beatrice, and not merely what use you can be to him." Beatrice considered this, turning the needle over in her fingers. "I have thought of that too, if I am honest. I do not know Mr. Grant beyond his letters. I do not know if we shall suit each other beyond the practical matters of a household and a ranch." "You may yet find you suit each other fine," Noah said, though something in his chest tightened uncomfortably at the thought, and he found he did not wish to examine too closely why that should be. By the second night in the shack, the storm showed no sign of relenting, and their meager supply of food had begun to dwindle. Noah rationed what remained carefully, giving Beatrice the larger portion despite her protests, and when she finally fell asleep on her narrow cot, exhausted from the cold and the strange, disorienting fear of being trapped so far from any other living soul, Noah sat awake by the fire for a long while, watching the rise and fall of her breathing, and found himself thinking thoughts he had no business thinking about a woman promised to another man. He told himself it was only the isolation, only the strange intimacy the storm had forced upon them, that made him feel this pull toward her. But when Beatrice stirred in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible, and pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, Noah found himself rising to check that she was warm enough, tucking the edge of the buffalo robe more securely around her, and lingering a moment longer than was strictly necessary before returning to his place by the fire. He did not sleep much that night. He told himself it was the responsibility of watching the fire, of listening for any change in the storm's fury. He did not let himself examine the other reason, not yet. The storm finally began to break on the morning of the third day, the wind dying down to a manageable moan, and the snow thinning enough that Noah judged it safe, or safe enough, to press on toward Sweetwater Bend. They packed the wagon in the gray pre-dawn light, Beatrice's fingers clumsy with cold despite her gloves, and set out once more into a landscape transformed almost beyond recognition, buried beneath drifts that in places rose higher than the wagon wheels. It was mid-morning when they came to the creek crossing that would prove the most dangerous moment of their journey. The creek, normally a shallow, easily forded stream, had frozen over during the storm, its surface disguised beneath a fresh layer of snow that made it indistinguishable from the solid ground around it. Noah had crossed this creek 100 times in better weather and knew its treacherous nature. The way the ice near the center never quite froze solid even in the coldest months, fed as it was by an underground spring. He guided the horses carefully, testing the footing as he went, but a sudden gust of wind spooked the lead horse just as they reached the center of the crossing, and the animal lurched sideways, cracking the ice beneath its hooves with a sound like a rifle shot. "Noah!" Beatrice cried out, as the wagon lurched violently and she felt the ice give way beneath one of the wheels. "Hold on!" Noah shouted, hauling hard on the reins, fighting to keep the panicked horses from bolting and dragging the wagon fully into the widening crack in the ice. For a terrible moment, Beatrice felt the wagon tilt beneath her, felt icy water splash up over the edge of the wagon bed and soak through her boots, and she cried out again, gripping the seat with both hands as though she could hold the whole world steady through sheer force of will. Noah threw himself from the wagon into the knee-deep freezing water, seizing the lead horse's bridle and hauling with every ounce of strength he possessed, shouting words of command and reassurance to the terrified animals, even as the cold water soaked through his boots and numbed his legs within seconds. Slowly, agonizingly, the horses found their footing on the solid ice nearer the bank, and with one final heave, Noah managed to drag the wagon free of the cracking ice and onto safer ground. He collapsed against the wagon wheel for a moment, breathing hard, his lower body soaked through and already beginning to ache with the deep, dangerous cold of the water. "Well, you are soaked through," Beatrice said, scrambling down from the wagon seat despite his protests, her own fear for herself forgotten entirely in her alarm for him. "You will freeze." "I will be all right," he said, though his teeth had already begun to chatter, and Beatrice, remembering everything she had ever heard about the dangers of frostbite and hypothermia, would not be dissuaded. "We must get you dry and warm now," she said, with a firmness that brooked no argument. "Is there shelter nearby?" "A half-mile on," Noah managed. "An old trapper's cabin, I know the way." They made the half-mile in a blur of urgency, Beatrice driving the wagon herself while Noah, shivering violently now, gave what direction he could through chattering teeth. The trapper's cabin, when they reached it, was smaller even than the lined shack, but it had a stove and a store of firewood, and Beatrice set to building a fire with a determination born of pure necessity, having watched Noah do it enough times now to manage well enough on her own. "You must get out of those wet clothes," she said, once the fire had caught, turning her back with brisk practicality to allow him privacy while he stripped off his soaked trousers and boots and wrapped himself in the driest blanket they had left. "Your legs, Noah, let me see them." "Beatrice, this is hardly proper," Noah protested, though his voice had gone thin and strained with the effort of controlling his shivering. "Propriety will not save you from frostbite," she said, kneeling beside him despite his protest and examining his legs with careful, clinical attention, relieved to find the skin reddened but not yet blackened with the telltale signs of frozen tissue. "You were fortunate. Another few minutes in that water and it might have been far worse." "I could not let the wagon go under, not with you in it," Noah said, his voice quiet now, stripped of its earlier bravado. Beatrice looked up at him, something in his face in the firelight making her breath catch unexpectedly. "You might have died, Noah, for me, a woman you had known only 2 days. I would do it again," he said simply, and the honesty in his voice left no room for doubt. She did not know what to say to that, and so she said nothing, only reached out and took his cold hand between both of hers, rubbing warmth back into his fingers with the same brisk care she had shown his legs. And if her heart beat a little faster than the effort warranted, She told herself it was only the lingering fear of the crossing, and nothing more. They spent that night in the trapper's cabin as well, both of them too shaken by the near disaster at the creek to consider pressing on in the fading afternoon light. And something had shifted between them in the aftermath of that danger. Some final wall of careful distance worn away by fear and gratitude, and the simple, undeniable fact that each had risked something for the other. "I have been thinking," Beatrice said, as they sat together before the fire that night, closer now than the formality of their first evening together would have allowed, "about what waits for me in Sweetwater Bend." "Elias is a good man," Noah said, though the words came harder now than they had before. "I do not doubt it," Beatrice said, "but I find myself wondering, Noah, if a good man is enough. I came west seeking steadiness, as I told you, but these last 3 days, trapped with you in this terrible storm, I have felt something I do not think I would have found in a lifetime of letters from Mr. Grant." Noah's heart pounded against his ribs. "Beatrice, I have no right to speak on this. You are promised to another man. I was hired only to see you safely to him." "I know," she said softly. "And I do not ask you to speak on it, only to know that I feel it too, whatever it is. I did not expect to find anything in this journey beyond cold and fear and the hope of reaching my destination. I did not expect to find you." They sat in silence for a long moment, the fire crackling between them, the weight of everything unsaid pressing heavy in the small room. Noah wanted, more than he had wanted anything in a long while, to reach across the space between them and take her hand, to tell her that he had felt the same pull from the moment he had seen her standing on that train platform, small and cold and braver than she knew. But he held himself back, bound by honor and by the promise he had made to a neighbor, and instead he said only, "We should rest. Tomorrow, if the weather holds, we will reach Sweetwater Bend." Beatrice nodded, though something in her eyes suggested she understood the restraint costing him as much as it cost her, and they settled into an uneasy sleep, each acutely aware of the other's presence across the small room, each wrestling with feelings neither was yet free to name. They reached Sweetwater Bend at last on the afternoon of the 4th day, the town emerging from the white landscape like something out of a half-remembered dream, its handful of buildings crusted with snow, smoke, rising thin and gray from chimneys against a sky that had finally, mercifully, cleared to a hard, bright blue. Noah guided the exhausted horses down the town's single street toward Elias Grant's ranch on the outskirts, his chest tight with a dread he could not quite name, some instinct warning him that whatever waited at the end of this journey would not be simple. They found Elias in his ranch house, his leg still splinted and propped on a stool before the fire, and beside him, seated in a chair that had clearly become accustomed to the space, sat a woman Noah recognized as Margaret Hutchins, a widow from town whose husband had died the previous spring of a fever. Elias' face, when he saw them enter, went the color of ash. "Noah," he said, struggling to rise from his chair and failing, wincing at the pain in his leg. "You made it through, thank God. I feared the worst when the storm did not let up." "We were delayed by the weather," Noah said carefully, his eyes moving between Elias and Margaret Hutchins with a growing, sinking understanding. "This is Miss Beatrice Underwood." Beatrice stepped forward, exhausted and travel-worn but holding herself with quiet dignity. "Mr. Grant, I am glad to finally meet you, though I confess the circumstances are not quite what I imagined." Elias' face had gone from ash to a deep, mortified red, and he glanced at Margaret Hutchins with an expression of such naked guilt that Beatrice felt the truth of the situation settle over her like a stone before a single word had been spoken. "Miss Underwood," Elias said, his voice thick with shame, "I owe you an apology beyond any I know how to give. When the storm came and no word arrived, and the telegraph lines went down, I feared something terrible had happened to you, or that you had changed your mind about coming at all. It has been near 2 weeks since your train was expected. I am ashamed to say I gave up hope of your arrival." "And so you found comfort elsewhere," Beatrice said quietly, understanding now the full shape of what had happened, though she felt strangely, distantly calm about it, as though the events of the past 3 days had already reordered her sense of what mattered. "Margaret and I were married 4 days ago by the circuit preacher," Elias admitted, unable to meet her eyes. "I believed you were not coming, Miss Underwood. I would never have taken such a step otherwise. I am deeply sorry for the wrong I have done you." Margaret Hutchins, for her part, looked equally stricken, rising from her chair with evident distress. "Miss Underwood, I did not know, I promise you, I did not know there was a woman still traveling to meet him. Elias told me only that his intended bride had failed to arrive, and that he believed the arrangement had fallen through. Had I known you were still on your way, I would never have agreed to marry him so soon." Beatrice looked between the two of them, this rancher who had once seemed her best hope for a steady future, and the woman who now occupied the place that had been promised to her, and felt something complicated move through her chest, not quite grief, not quite relief, but some strange tangle of both. "I do not blame either of you," she said finally, and found to her own surprise that she meant it. "The storm delayed us 3 extra days beyond what should have been a simple journey. You could not have known we would be trapped as we were. This is no one's fault but the weather's, and perhaps the slowness of the mail in reaching you before I ever left St. Louis. You are gracious, Miss Underwood, far more gracious than I deserve," Elias said, "but I do not know what is to become of you now. You have crossed half a continent on the strength of a promise I have broken. I will make whatever arrangements I can to see you safely settled, whatever that requires of me." Beatrice felt, for the first time since stepping into the ranch house, the full weight of her situation settle upon her. She had no home to return to, no husband waiting, and precious little money beyond what remained from selling her mother's few remaining possessions before she left St. Louis. She stood in a strange territory, among strangers, with nothing certain ahead of her, and for a moment the exhaustion of the journey and the shock of this final betrayal threatened to overwhelm her entirely. It was Noah who spoke into the silence, his voice steady and sure in a way that drew every eye in the room to him. "Miss Underwood will not want for shelter or care while matters are settled," he said. "There is a boarding house in town run by Mrs. Alma Foster, decent and respectable. I will see her settled there myself, and Elias, I trust you will see to whatever costs are owed, given the circumstances." "Of course," Elias said quickly, grateful for anything that might ease his conscience. "Whatever is needed, I will provide it." Beatrice looked at Noah, and something passed between them, unspoken but unmistakable, a promise that whatever came next, she would not face it entirely alone. The boarding house of Mrs. Alma Foster sat at the edge of Sweetwater Bend's single street, a narrow 2-story building with a covered porch and windows that glowed warm and yellow in the winter evenings. Mrs. Foster herself was a widow of some 60 years, sharp-eyed and kind-hearted in equal measure, and she took Beatrice in without hesitation once Noah had explained the circumstances, clucking with sympathy over the whole sorry affair. "Men," Mrs. Foster said, shaking her head as she showed Beatrice to a small but comfortable room on the second floor. Elias Grant was always a practical sort, but practicality without patience makes for poor judgment if you ask me. You are welcome here as long as you need, Miss Underwood, and we will see about finding you honest work while you decide what is to come next." That work came sooner than Beatrice expected, and from an unlikely source. Sweetwater Bend, it turned out, had no dedicated seamstress, its women making do with mail-order patterns and their own uncertain skills, or traveling all the way to Rock Springs for anything requiring finer needlework. Within a week of her arrival, word had spread of Beatrice's skill with a needle, thanks in no small part to Mrs. Foster's enthusiastic recommendations to every woman who crossed her threshold, and Beatrice found herself with more mending and dressmaking work than she could easily manage alone. It was honest work, and it paid enough to cover her board and put a little aside besides, and there was a satisfaction in it that surprised her, a sense of building something of her own in this strange new place, independent of any man's promise or provision. She thought sometimes of the life she might have had as Elias Grant's wife, a life of ranch work and household duties bound to another person's fortunes, and found she did not entirely regret the way things had turned out, whatever pain the betrayal had caused in the moment. She saw Noah often in those first weeks, more often than either of them perhaps admitted to needing. He found reasons to come into town, small errands at the mercantile that could easily have waited, and always he found his way to Mrs. Foster's boarding house, where he would sit with Beatrice on the porch or in the parlor, depending on the weather, and they would talk for hours about everything and nothing, the easy intimacy they had built during those 3 terrible days on the trail only deepening with each visit. "You are here again," Beatrice said one evening in early February, opening the door to find Noah on the porch, hat in hand, a faint flush of cold or something else coloring his cheeks. "I brought thread," he said, holding up a small paper packet with an expression of such transparent flimsiness that Beatrice could not help but laugh. "Thread that could have waited until my next visit to the mercantile, I am sure." "Perhaps," Noah admitted, and something in his voice grew more serious. "Beatrice, may I speak plainly with you?" "Please," she said, gesturing him inside out of the cold, her heart already beginning to quicken in anticipation of whatever he meant to say. They settled in the small parlor, Mrs. Foster having tactfully excused herself to the kitchen, and Noah turned his hat over in his hands several times before he found the words he was searching for. "I have thought of little else these past weeks but you," he said finally, his eyes meeting hers with an honesty that left no room for misunderstanding. "I know it has been barely a month since that storm brought us together, and I know the circumstances of your arrival here were not what either of us hoped for, but I cannot pretend any longer that what I feel for you is nothing more than the concern of a man who once acted as your escort." Beatrice's breath caught in her chest. "Noah, I love you," he said simply, the words plain and unadorned in the way that suited him, but no less powerful for their simplicity. "I loved you before we ever reached Sweetwater Bend, though I would not let myself name it while you were promised to another man. That promise is broken now, through no fault of your own, and I find I cannot let another day pass without telling you the truth of my heart." Tears rose unexpectedly in Beatrice's eyes, and she found herself laughing even as she wiped at them, overwhelmed by the sudden rush of feeling. "I have loved you since that first night in the line shack, I think, though I did not dare admit it even to myself. You are a good man, Noah Keller. A far better man than I had any right to hope for when I boarded that train in St. Louis." Noah reached across the small space between them and took her hand, his fingers warm despite the cold outside, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, content simply to sit together in the quiet acknowledgement of feelings finally spoken aloud. "I would not ask you to rush into anything," Noah said eventually. "You have been through enough upheaval these past weeks, but I would ask you to consider, when you are ready, whether you might build a life with me. Not out of necessity, as you came west to do with Elias, but because you wish it, because you love me as I love you." "I do not need time to consider it, Noah," Beatrice said, her voice steady despite the tears still bright in her eyes. "I have known my own heart since that night by the fire when you gave up your own comfort to see me warm and safe. I would build a life with you gladly, whenever you are ready to ask it properly." Noah's face broke into a smile so wide and unguarded that Beatrice felt her own heart swell to see it, and he rose from his seat to kneel before her, taking both her hands in his. "Beatrice Underwood," he said, "I do not have much beyond a small ranch and a herd of horses, and a heart that has been yours since the moment I saw you standing on that train platform. But I would be the proudest man in the Wyoming Territory if you would consent to be my wife." "Yes," Beatrice said, laughing and crying at once. "Yes, Noah, 1,000 times yes." They were married in the spring, once the last of the winter snow had melted and the prairie had begun to bloom with the first wildflowers of the season, in a ceremony held in the small church at the center of Sweetwater Bend. The whole town turned out for the occasion, having followed the strange and romantic tale of the mail-order bride, whose journey through the blizzard had led her not to the man who had summoned her, but to the man who had saved her. Elias Grant and Margaret Hutchins, now Margaret Grant, attended as well, their earlier awkwardness long since smoothed over by time and by Beatrice's genuine lack of resentment toward either of them. Margaret had, in fact, become something of a friend to Beatrice in the weeks since her arrival, the two women bonding over the shared strangeness of building new lives in unfamiliar territory. And it was Margaret who helped Beatrice with the final stitches on her wedding dress, a simple but elegant gown of pale blue fabric that Beatrice had sewn herself from cloth purchased at the Sweetwater Bend Mercantile. "I am glad it turned out this way," Elias told Noah quietly, as the two men stood together outside the church before the ceremony began, both dressed in their best clothes for the occasion. "I have carried guilt over the wrong I did Miss Underwood, but I cannot regret it, seeing how happy the two of you are together. Some things, I think, work out as they are meant to, however strange the path that leads there." "I do not know that I believe in fate, Elias," Noah said, watching through the church window as Beatrice adjusted her veil with Margaret's help, her face glowing with a happiness that took his breath away even from this distance. "But I know that I would not trade these past months for anything, storm and all." The ceremony itself was simple, as most frontier weddings were, but no less meaningful for its simplicity. The circuit preacher, the same man who had married Elias and Margaret weeks before, spoke words that felt to Beatrice far more true and binding than any legal contract could have managed. And when Noah slipped a plain gold band onto her finger, purchased with money he had been saving for a new horse before deciding there was no better use for it in all the world, Beatrice felt the last of her old grief and uncertainty settle finally into peace. "I, Noah Keller, take thee, Beatrice Underwood, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he said, his voice steady despite the tears standing bright in his eyes, "to have and to hold through blizzard and drought, through hardship and joy, for as long as we both shall live." "I, Beatrice Underwood, take thee, Noah Keller," she answered, her own voice thick with emotion, "to be my lawfully wedded husband, through every storm this country sends our way, and every clear morning after, for as long as we both shall live." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the small church erupted in applause and cheering, Mrs. Foster dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, and even Elias and Margaret joining in the celebration with genuine warmth, any lingering awkwardness between them and Beatrice long since dissolved. The town held a celebration that evening at the largest barn on the edge of Sweetwater Bend, decorated with lanterns and wildflowers, with fiddle music and dancing that lasted well into the night. Beatrice, who had never in her life imagined such a celebration in her honor, found herself swept from partner to partner in the dancing, though she always found her way back to Noah's arms by the end of each tune, content simply to be held by him, to feel the steady beat of his heart against her own. "I keep thinking of that first night in the line shack," she said, as they danced together beneath the lantern light, the fiddle music swirling around them. "I was so frightened, Noah, and so uncertain of everything. I never imagined it would lead here." "Nor did I," Noah admitted. "I only knew I could not let anything happen to you, whatever the storm threw at us. I did not yet understand why that mattered so much to me, only that it did." "I am glad the storm delayed us," Beatrice said, smiling up at him. "I know that sounds strange, given everything it cost us, but if we had reached Sweetwater Bend on schedule, I would have married Elias, and I would never have known what I was missing." "I have thought the same more than once," Noah said. "It is a strange thing to be grateful for a blizzard that near killed us both. But I find I cannot regret a single hour of it, not when it led me to you." They settled into married life on Noah's small ranch east of town, the house that had felt too quiet and too large for one man now filled with warmth and laughter, and the constant, comfortable presence of a woman Noah could not imagine his life without. Beatrice continued her sewing work, her reputation growing throughout the surrounding territory, until she was taking commissions from as far away as Rock Springs, and the money she earned went toward expanding the ranch, adding new stock to Noah's herd of horses, and eventually building an addition onto the house itself, a proper parlor where Beatrice could receive her clients in comfort. The following winter, gentler than the terrible one that had brought them together, Beatrice discovered she was expecting their first child, and the news filled the small ranch house with a joy that seemed to Noah almost too large to contain. He built a cradle himself over the following months, working in the evenings by lamplight after his ranch chores were done, carving small decorative flourishes into the wood, with the same careful attention he brought to everything he undertook. Their son was born in the early autumn of 1888, a healthy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's steady, thoughtful eyes. They named him William, after Beatrice's father, in a gesture of forgiveness and remembrance that brought tears to Beatrice's eyes when she first spoke the name aloud, holding her newborn son against her chest, while Noah looked on with an expression of such profound tenderness that she thought her heart might burst from the fullness of it. "He has your look about him already," Noah said, gently touching his son's tiny hand. "That same seriousness you get when you are concentrating on your sewing. And your stubbornness, I suspect, given how long he took to arrive," Beatrice said, laughing despite her exhaustion, and Noah laughed with her, the sound filling the small bedroom with warmth against the cold autumn evening outside. 2 years later, a daughter followed whom they named Ruth, and the ranch house that had once seemed too quiet for one man now rang with the sounds of children's laughter and the ordinary, beautiful chaos of family life. Beatrice taught her children to read from her mother's old Bible, the same one she had carried west in her trunk on that fateful journey, and she told them, as they grew old enough to understand, the story of how their parents had come to find each other, through blizzard and hardship and a broken promise that had, in the end, led to something far better than either of them could have imagined. Elias and Margaret Grant remained close friends to Noah and Beatrice throughout the years that followed, their two families often gathering for holidays and celebrations, the old awkwardness of that first difficult meeting long since transformed into genuine affection and gratitude on all sides. Elias, in particular, took a special interest in young William Keller as the boy grew, teaching him to rope and ride alongside his own children, and often remarked, with a fondness that had grown easier over the years, that he considered the whole strange affair of the delayed bride to be the finest mistake he had ever made, given how happily it had turned out for everyone involved. Mrs. Alma Foster, too, remained a beloved figure in the Keller family's life, standing as godmother to both William and Ruth, and never tiring of telling the story of how she had taken in a heartbroken young bride one terrible winter and watched her blossom into the happiest woman in the Wyoming Territory. Sweetwater Bend itself grew over the years that followed, as the territory edged toward statehood and more families arrived to settle the surrounding land, and Beatrice's small dressmaking business grew alongside it, eventually employing 2 other women from town to help meet the demand for her work. She never forgot the hardship of her early years, the injustice of a world that had offered women so few paths to independence and security, and she made it a point, throughout her life, to offer work and kindness to other women who found themselves in difficult circumstances, remembering always how close she had come to despair on the day she learned of Elias Grant's hasty marriage, and how differently things might have turned out without the kindness and courage of the man who had ridden 3 days through a blizzard to bring her safely to a home she had not yet known she would find. Noah, for his part, continued to grow his horse ranch into one of the most respected in the region, known throughout the territory for the quality of his stock and the honesty of his dealings. But he never forgot, either, the lessons of that terrible storm, the fragility of life in this beautiful and unforgiving country, and he made certain, every winter thereafter, to check on his neighbors before any storm could trap them unprepared, remembering always the parents he had lost so many years before. and determined that no one under his care or in his community should suffer the same fate if he could help it. On the 20th anniversary of that first terrible journey, Noah and Beatrice rode out together, just the two of them, to the site of the old trapper's cabin where they had sheltered after the near disaster at the creek crossing. The cabin had long since fallen into disrepair, its roof collapsed, and its walls leaning with age, but the creek still ran nearby, peaceful now in the gentle warmth of a summer afternoon, nothing like the frozen, treacherous thing it had been on that terrible day 2 decades before. "Do you remember how frightened I was?" Beatrice asked, as they sat together on a fallen log near the creek's edge, watching their now-grown children, William at 18 and Ruth at 16, wade in the shallow water with the easy confidence of young people who had grown up knowing this land as home rather than as a dangerous unknown. "I remember," Noah said, taking her hand, the years having weathered them both but done nothing to dim the affection between them. "I remember thinking I had never been so frightened in my life, not for myself, but for you. I did not yet understand why your safety mattered so much to me, only that I would have given anything to see you through that storm unharmed." "You did give something," Beatrice said softly. "You nearly froze yourself, saving that wagon at the creek crossing." "A small price," Noah said, "for the finest thing that has ever happened to me." Beatrice leaned her head against his shoulder, watching their children laugh together in the summer sunlight, and thought of all the paths her life might have taken, the marriage to Elias Grant that would have been steady but perhaps never truly happy, the return to St. Louis that pride and circumstance might have forced upon her, the countless small twists of fate that had instead led her here, to this creek, to this man, to this life she had built with her own hands out of hardship and courage and, ultimately, love. "I would not change a single moment of it," she said. "Not the storm, not the betrayal, not any of it. It all led here to this." "To this," Noah agreed, and kissed her softly, there beside the creek where their story had so nearly ended in tragedy, and had instead become the foundation of everything good that followed. They rode home together as the sun began to set, their children ahead of them on the trail, laughing and racing each other back, toward the ranch house that had grown, over 20 years, from a lonely bachelor's dwelling into the warm, bustling center of a family built on love that had survived the worst that winter and circumstance could throw against it. The Wyoming Territory had become a state in the years since their marriage, the wildness of the frontier gradually giving way to towns and railroads and the slow, steady march of civilization. But some things, Beatrice had learned, never changed. The vastness of the sky above the prairie, the particular gold of a Wyoming sunset, and the unshakable truth that love, once found through hardship and tested through fire, or in their case through ice and storm, only grew stronger with each passing year. That night, after the children had gone to bed and the ranch house had settled into its familiar evening quiet, Noah and Beatrice sat together on the porch they had built together in their second year of marriage, watching the stars emerge one by one in the clear Wyoming sky. "Do you ever think about Elias?" Beatrice asked. "About what might have happened if you had reached Sweetwater Bend on schedule?" "Sometimes," Noah admitted, "but I do not dwell on it long. Whatever might have been, this is what is, and I would not trade it for any version of a life that did not include you." "Nor would I," Beatrice said, resting her head against his shoulder as she had done 1,000 times over the years, and would do 1,000 times more before their story finally reached its natural end. Decades hence, surrounded by children and grandchildren, who would grow up hearing the tale of the blizzard that had brought their grandparents together. A story that would be told and retold around that same fireplace for generations, growing only more treasured with each telling. "3 days through a blizzard," she murmured, half to herself. "I never arrived where I was meant to go. I arrived somewhere far better instead." "So did I," Noah said, and pulled her closer against the cooling night air, both of them content in the knowledge that whatever storms life might yet send their way, they would weather them together, as they had weathered that first terrible one so many years before, when a bride who never arrived at her intended destination had found, instead, exactly where she belonged. The years continued to unfold with the steady rhythm of ranch life, seasons turning from planting to harvest to the long quiet of winter and back again. And Noah and Beatrice grew old together in the home they had built from the ashes of a broken promise. William eventually took over much of the ranch's operation as Noah's hands grew less steady with age, marrying a young schoolteacher from Rock Springs and raising his own family on land adjoining his father's. Ruth, ever her mother's daughter, opened her own dress shop in the growing town of Sweetwater Bend, which had by then acquired its own post office and a proper schoolhouse, teaching the trade to a new generation of young women who found in sewing not just a livelihood, but a measure of the same independence Beatrice herself had discovered decades before. On the day Noah Keller drew his last breath, an old man of 78 surrounded by children and grandchildren in the same ranch house he had built as a young bachelor, Beatrice held his hand and remembered, as she often did in those final years, the young cowboy who had ridden through a blizzard to keep a promise to a neighbor, never knowing that promise would deliver into his life the woman who would become the whole of his heart. 3 days, she whispered to him, as his eyes grew heavy with the peace of a life well lived. You rode 3 days through that terrible storm, Noah Keller, and you gave me a lifetime in return. He smiled at her, weak but genuine, his hand tightening briefly around hers. The finest 3 days of my life, he murmured, leading to the finest years a man could ask for. Beatrice lived another decade after that, surrounded always by the family they had built together, and when her own time came, she was laid to rest beside her husband on a small rise overlooking the ranch they had loved, within sight of the creek where a young couple had once nearly lost everything to ice and cold, and had instead found the beginning of everything that mattered most. Their story became a treasured piece of Sweetwater Bend's history, told to newcomers and children alike, a reminder that sometimes the roads life sends us down are not the ones we intended to travel, and that the truest destinations are not always the ones marked on any map, but the ones we find, unexpected and unearned, when we open our hearts to the possibilities a storm might carry. For in the end, the bride who never arrived at her intended destination had found something far greater than the steady, practical life she had sought when she first answered a stranger's advertisement in a St. Louis newspaper. She had found love forged in ice and fire, tested by hardship and betrayal, and made stronger for having survived both, a love that had outlasted the harshest winter the Wyoming Territory had ever known, and had warmed 2 hearts, and then a family, and then a whole community, for the rest of their long and happy lives together.